Instantly claiming central territory, this pawn lunges forward, dictating the early game's positional dynamics. Mirroring the king's pawn establishes symmetrical central control, opening lines for bishops and queen. Developing the knight to f3 immediately contests the central e5 pawn and prepares for castling, a crucial step for king safety. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies the center and prepares to challenge white's attacking ideas. Reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to contest the d5 square, white subtly expands influence. A playful pin emerges, eyeing the central knight and creating immediate pressure across the board. The knight boldly ventures to d5, challenging black's structure and forcing a tactical decision. Solidifying the knight's position and preparing for kingside castling builds a strong defensive structure. Embracing the center, white aims to expand influence and challenge black's bishop. Solidifying the pawn chain now allows black to consider opening lines for their pieces. This position opens up lines for attack, potentially forcing black's knight into a vulnerable square. This diagonal thrust aims to disrupt white's coordination and potentially snag material if a knight is carelessly placed. Sacrificing a pawn opens lines and invites piece activity, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king. Recapturing the pawn opens up the d-file for white's rook, demanding immediate attention to defensive coordination. Challenging the bishop's placement directly addresses black's pressure and prepares for a more active central pawn push. Dislodging the knight on d5 becomes a priority, aiming to untangle black's pieces and improve bishop activity on the long diagonal. Challenging black's central pawn structure, this queen redeployment prepares potential kingside expansion and aims to control key squares. Developing the knight to f6 reinforces the e5 pawn and prepares for king safety. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal here aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Securing the king's safety by castling is a prudent decision, bringing the rook into play while simultaneously untangling the knight. Exposing black's king with doubled pawns creates lasting structural weaknesses. Recapturing with the bishop reshapes the central pawn structure, opening a diagonal for your queen and potentially creating a weakness on white's kingside if they advance their pawn. Securing the king on the queen side anticipates potential queenside expansion, while preparing to activate the rooks for central control. Reclaiming the pawn opens critical lines for white's rooks, while black repositions the bishop to a more defensive outpost, fortifying the king. Exchanging the bishop for the knight disrupts black's pawn structure and opens the c-file, a potential pathway for white's rooks. Opening the b-file creates dynamic counterplay, but the doubled pawns weaken the queenside structure for the long haul. Sacrificing the knight for pawn structure damage is a bold positional gamble, opening lines for your queen. Reclaiming the pawn, black's queen now eyes the vital central files, while white's king remains exposed on the queenside. Restoring central pawn presence clears the way for queenside piece activation. Establishing a solid pawn majority on the queenside, the rook prepares to exert pressure along the open b-file. Securing the bishop's diagonal, white prepares to disrupt black's queenside structure. The rook ventures out, aiming to disrupt white's central control and exploit the open b-file for potential pressure. Pressing the attack, white aims to exploit the doubled pawns and open lines towards black's king. Re-establishing the rook's connection on the b-file now prepares for a potential pawn storm or a positional squeeze against white's isolated queenside structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to create long-term defensive stability. Unleashing a pawn to disrupt white's bishop battery and gain a tempo for repositioning the knight is a sensible reaction to the looming pressure. Exchanging queen simplifies, but the doubled pawns black will face after. Gxf6 could become a serious weakness. Restructuring the pawn chain significantly alters the kingside defense, creating clear weaknesses that will demand careful handling. Consolidating the rook aims to establish pressure on the d-file, but it concedes control of the c-file and leaves the king side slightly exposed. Unleashing the f-pawn disrupts white's pawn structure and attempts to activate black's king. Reclaiming the central pawn opens a clear path for your rook, creating immediate threats. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop reshapes the pawn structure, creating an isolated d-pawn for white and opening diagonals for your pieces. Targeting the isolated pawn creates immediate pressure and aims to exploit the weak queenside structure. This retreat repositions the bishop to a more passive defensive role, creating potential weaknesses on the dark squares. Controlling the central open file with the rook is a prime objective, creating threats along the d-file. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal now prepares for potential pressure on white's queenside pawn structure. Challenging black's queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to disrupt their coordination and potentially create weaknesses. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Repositioning the knight to its more active c4 outpost promises to disrupt black's cramped queenside. Reclaiming the central file is crucial. Consolidating your rook power now will pressure white's kingside. Recentering the knight aims to exploit black's doubled pawns and potentially launch an attack on the kingside. Simplifying the position by trading rooks is a sensible choice, aiming for a slightly more manageable endgame. Securing the king's central position now becomes the immediate priority, as the pawn structure has become permanently imbalanced. Initiating a late game with active king play, this check seeks to disrupt white's consolidating position. Relocating the monarch to a safer corner is a wise defensive maneuver, seeking shelter from the open files and potential threats. The black king awkwardly steps into the open, seeking refuge, but its safety remains a significant concern. Unleashing the rook's power, this aggressive push aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the exposed king. Consolidating your king's safety is paramount after the rook exchange. Find a more secure haven. Targeting the king's escape squares with this knight suddenly reignites the queenside pressure. Reuniting the rooks to contest the open d-file becomes paramount for black's survival. Forking the black king and rook with a devastating knight sacrifice, forcing significant material loss. Trading down seems unavoidable now, and securing the king's safety becomes paramount before white can exploit the open files. Sacrificing the knight opens a kingside assault, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. Reclaiming central space is paramount after the king's brief jaunt, aiming to activate the rook and challenge the imposing knight. The rook infiltrates the 7th rank, setting the stage for a decisive attack on the exposed black king. A critical defensive maneuver seeks to unblock the bishop's diagonal and potentially escape the suffocating pressure on the kingside. The king's exposed position offers tactical opportunities, forcing a king hunt across the board. The black king, a magnet for tactical dangers, is now uncomfortably exposed to a looming discovered check. Unleashing a pawn storm aims to disrupt black's king's safety and create attacking avenues. Launching a pawn offense here, black desperately tries to activate their isolated king, but it exposes them to immediate counterplay along the open files. Unleashing a powerful rook along the open 8th rank, the knight's retreat to safety promises a fierce assault on black's exposed king. Accepting the rook sacrifice unwinds the pawn structure, exposing your king to the aggressive advanced rook. Clearing a path, the knight infiltrates enemy territory, aiming to exploit the weakened king position and the open file. The king's journey through the center now exposes it to dangerous checks. Unleashing the knight towards the weak king creates decisive tactical threats. Re-establishing bishop presence on the queen side offers some counterplay. Solidifying the king's shelter with this pawn advance creates a more secure haven against black's encroaching pieces. The king's central journey, though ambitious, now invites overwhelming pressure from white's activated pieces. Hoping to exploit a weakened kingside by pushing forward, but this gambit might open lines for black's remaining pieces.